In Native American lore, there was a older Indian patriarch who was known as Good Eagle. And he was fond of telling stories from the Indian background. And he did so for the entertainment, basically, of his grandchildren, but he also wanted to impart wisdom for his grandchildren to see reality from a certain perspective. And so he told them that there was one story, that in all of us, in every person, there are two wolves. And these wolves are engaged in a struggle. There is the wolf of justice, peace, and loving kindness. And then there is the other wolf, one who is of fear and hatred, one who has selfishness and greed that animates him. And so one of the grandchildren said to the Indian grandfather, "But which wolf will win? Who will come out on top in this struggle?" And the grandfather replied, "Whichever one we feed." And so during this season of Advent, we continue to welcome Christ into our lives. And you and I face those wolves within each one of us, that they vie for the precious food of our energy and of our attention. And perhaps the first important step in all of this, as we recognize this vying within our own experience, is to recognize the wolves themselves, to identify them, to say, yes, they are real. They do exist within my own experience. And then the second step is just for each of us to decide, which one am I going to feed? Which one am I going to somehow feed in order that that one might predominate in the struggle that all of us experience with these two wolves? John the Baptist, in his enthusiastic preaching, caused people to raise questions in their own hearts as they prepared for the coming of the Messiah. And so they asked the questions, are we feeding the wolves of selfishness? That we have hoarded goods and overlooked the needs of the poor? Have we fed the wolves who worshiped wealth and sacrificed and used very poor ethics in terms of accomplishing that wealth, cheating and really defying others in terms of justice? Or have we been people of ambition and greed, feeding that particular wolf? And so in that very process, we agitate ourselves and we provide the wolf of hate, of anger, of all of those sorts of ambition to prevail. Every Advent, we hear the story of John, and we hear that he is proclaiming the imminent coming of the Christ. And so as the people of his time raise the question, what are we to do? We also are called to raise that very same question as we prepare for Jesus. And we are asking, therefore, what is it truly that we ought to do? And in essence, we're asking that question, which wolves are to be fed? And which wolves are to be put on a permanent diet by us? And with the passage of the time between the first and the last coming of Jesus, that sometimes in our expectations we become a little apathetic. We become somewhat full of denial that it's coming, but it's not coming, and it's not that imminent. And we set up our ways and we tend to procrastinate because we really do not follow through on what we ought to do, on how we should feed that wolf that really has the timely message of life. And to counter this, we have the example of children, so many of whom are here with us this morning. And they're anticipating in a very special way, as children throughout the world, the coming of Santa Claus, of St. Nicholas, of Père Noël. And we know from our own experience that they really make Christmas through their excitements, through their anticipation, through that energy that they somehow bring about in anticipation of that coming of that special Santa Claus or whomever is part of the myth of Christmas. But we in turn procrastinate. We put aside the coming of Jesus with all that it means. And sometimes that means that we give way to the wolves of doubt and discouragement, and they eat away at the very hope that we have. And we look at the world and see the ills of the world as incurable. We wait, but we do so with no expectation, with no excitement that the coming of Christ is there, but we do not really give it our full enthusiasm. We hope, but with no basis of conviction, that we say that it is coming, but that conviction is not as strong or as positive or at the very edge as it should be. We anticipate, but without enough to ignite our action, to really enable those wolves of goodness and love and power, animated by the Spirit and love of the Lord Jesus, to really come forward and to be born in our time. As a counterforce to the hungry wolves that threaten our peace and rattle our faith, the two other speakers in our scriptures today, the writers Zephaniah and Paul, raise very powerful and prophetic voices. And they give us the reminder that the Lord is in our midst, nearer than our very own breath, that this Lord whom we truly revere and love and care for and want truly to take over us is nearer to us and present to us today. And so we think of the presence of this God in his word that has just been proclaimed for us, in his Spirit that is alive in our hearts, in his sacrament and community that gathers us all together so beautifully today in the celebration of this liturgy. And so this presence calls for uplifting and for rejoicing. As the theme of the Sunday itself says, Gaudete Sunday, that because the Lord is so present and so near that the only response that we can adequately give is one of joy, one of deep, deep appreciation. And as the problems of struggles of our own personal lives, of our world in which we live, are still closely pressing upon us, does that mean that they're completely eradicated and it doesn't happen, that we don't have the struggles and we don't have the ills and difficulties that we experience in the world? Of course, they go on. But God is never still. His presence is deeper and fuller and more pervasive than all of these problems, than all of these difficulties. And our conviction of God's presence enables us to experience joy as God does, that in the spite of all of this, that there is this deep-rooted reality that his love will prevail, and that we know this from our firmest conviction, and therefore at the basis of all of our lives is this powerful and abiding joy. And our trust in this presence of God allows us to stop feeding the wolves of fear and anxiety and worry. And it enables us to look confidently when every wolf that is within us will be very content to live in the presence of the Lamb, the redeeming Lamb who has brought life to all of us.